All free episodes of Addressing Gettysburg are brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. To become a sponsor, send an email to matt@addressinggettysburg.com, and to be a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg today. And we thank you in advance.
Okay, we're going to start the program now so that I don't run over too long. So, you know, it looks like everybody who's here has been here before, but we do the programs every Sunday. In the winter, we try to, unless there's some event where we don't want to compete with. It looks like Christmas or New Year's. So it looks like this year we have 3 programs on consecutive weeks here in December, 3 programs in January, and 3 in February because of the way the holiday schedule hits. So theoretically, I will, you know, I posted all the December ones just on in a general fashion, and then I'll, you know, on Wednesdays or something like that, I'll post specific information about each program. So the program tonight is called Milroy's Wagon Train, and it's about the panic created by a group of military supply wagons at the very outset of the Gettysburg campaign. Next week, I'm doing one of my favorite topics that if you haven't seen my YouTube videos on the topic, I have more extensive information on my program. It's called Battle Babies. And it's about women who are pregnant at the time of the battle and give birth before, during, or immediately after the fighting. And I am absolutely positive that no one else has ever done a program on this subject before. And also part of the Battle Babies program is I will identify the last surviving veteran of the battle, meaning the last surviving civilian who was here in the town during the battle, and you know, when the last ones died away. Obviously, you know, military veterans, you know, you have to be like, you know, theoretically 16 to 20 years old, and then, you know, you're going to survive a long time. But the last surviving veteran of the battle who's a civilian can be like 6 months old at the time and live quite a long time after that. So there's quite a few of them that are kind of interesting. And again, no one has ever done any research on that topic before. I wonder why. And then there's a third thing that is attached to my Battle Babies program that I'm very interested in, and that's children who were named after commanders in the battle. And that's something I'm really into. And I'm sure everybody knows, like Rosa Meade Thorne. But there's actually a bunch of children named after General Meade. And I have some named after other people that are involved in the battle that you probably don't know about. So that's the program for next week. And then I think on the, maybe it's the 18th, whenever that hits, that third Sunday, I'm doing one on debris of battle, about the aftermath of the battle and how Gettysburg transforms itself into a tourist industry, which is something I always like to talk about. But tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Milroy's Wagon Train. And if you're not familiar with what the topic is about, Robert Milroy is in charge of the garrison at Winchester, Virginia, at the outset of the Gettysburg campaign. And because of the fear that the post might be attacked, they pack up a bunch of their supplies in wagons and have them ready to move. And so when the Southerners appear, some of the wagons are able to ride away. But over the course of the next few days, these wagons driven by Army Teamsters get a little out of control and believe that they're being chased by the Southerners as they pass from Winchester to Martinsburg, to Williamsport, to Hagerstown, to Greencastle, to Chambersburg, to Carlisle, and Harrisburg. And they cause a massive panic in the Cumberland Valley that it's just amazing all the different accounts we have of it. This topic is not covered in a lot of books. It's covered a little bit in Here Come the Rebels by Wilbur Nye, the Civil War guy. It's also discussed in like a sentence or two in Coddington, A Study in Command. But it's not a topic that's generated a lot of interest over the years. And it is remarkable, as I'm sure you'll get quickly tired of, how many accounts I have of the chaos and confusion that the wagon train created. So just to start off, giving a general idea of what we're talking about, is this is the area of the part of the campaign we're discussing on a map. And I thought I'd put on the map Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington and Winchester and Harrisburg. And I should mention that since we're broadcasting this on the podcast, it is not necessary for the people on the podcast to actually see the slides to understand what I'm referring to. But if they would like, they could get out a map and they could follow Milroy's wagon train. It basically, the whole first part of the program, they travel on Route 11 from Winchester, Virginia to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 81 was not there at that time. But throughout the program, I'm going to throw up a map and show you the distances we're discussing and the driving directions here now. So Winchester, Virginia to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, according to Google Maps for your car, is 118 miles. And in the general accounts of the campaign, Milroy's wagon train covers about 120 miles. So, you know, it's in the ballpark. It's kind of accurate. I would like to point out that the best map that shows the area where the Gettysburg campaign occurred is in Samuel Bates' Martial Deeds of Pennsylvania, if you're not familiar with it. And I actually took this map off the Internet Archives to show it here, just in a general fashion. But if like a map maker is out there and wants to be inspired by someone else's map or steal the information like they usually do, you can look at this as probably the best map of the area of the campaign. And I don't know how many people use it, but it's called From Fredericksburg to Harrisburg. And at the bottom of the map, on the map, you can kind of see the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River in Washington and Fredericksburg. And off to the top left of the map is the area of Winchester, Virginia. Again, it's not really necessary that you see the specifics here at the moment. And then the area they show north of Winchester, Baltimore is kind of shown as a really small city on this map. I don't know if I like that. But then off to the left, there's kind of Harper's Ferry, and you can kind of see the area of the Cumberland Valley Railroad, which starts at Harrisburg up near the top of the map and forms sort of a semicircle going down to Hagerstown. So it's a really good map if you're trying to study the movements in the campaign from Fredericksburg, up the Confederate invasion route. Now, I should preface Milroy's wagon train on just a small discussion about a difference of opinion that occurred between the federal government and Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania. Throughout the war, there was the fear that the Southern Army might invade Pennsylvania. And the way that it would be most obvious to invade Pennsylvania would be to cross over the mountain range into the Shenandoah Valley and move northward across the Potomac River through Maryland into Pennsylvania. And throughout the war, Governor Curtin tried his best to convince the authorities in Washington that the best way to protect the state of Pennsylvania from invasion was to put a force of soldiers on the border of Pennsylvania as a deterrent for a Confederate invasion. Just their mere presence of a large force there would keep the Southerners from thinking about moving in that direction. And they could handle any small detachment or raid that would be sent in that direction. As a matter of fact, the Pennsylvania Reserves were originally raised to protect the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland. But, of course, the authorities in Washington have different ideas. And their idea is that if Pennsylvania just sends all the troops that it can raise to the federal government and they're put into the Army, then the Union Army can defeat the Southern Army, thereby eliminating the threat of invasion. And throughout the war, these two competing views of how Pennsylvania should be defended conflict with each other. And of course, this leads to the border being unprotected and the Southern Army being able to invade the way they do. Now, of course, Governor Curtin, and then we have Darius Couch, or Darius Cooch. You know, there's a debate about how you pronounce this guy's name. But on June 9th, the War Department forms the Department of the Susquehanna. And this is largely because of a meeting that was held with the authorities in Washington over the best way to protect the border in the face of a threatened invasion that seemed apparent after the Battle of Chancellorsville in late May and early June 1863. The problem is, Couch is given his job. He arrives in Harrisburg on July 11th. He makes preparations. He doesn't have men. They have to raise troops. They have to build defenses. And, it's fortunate that the defenses at Harrisburg that he constructs and the troops that he assembles are never really put to the test by the Southern Army attacking Harrisburg. Now, other people that are involved in this are Henry Halleck, of course, who was the chief of staff, and then Robert Schenck, who was in charge of the Middle Military Department, which prior to the Department of the Susquehanna being formed, it included, Maryland and parts of West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Robert Schenck and Henry Halleck have a difference of opinion as to how the area of, invasion, threatened invasion, should be defended also. And it's their conflict that causes the disaster at Winchester, Virginia. And simply put, if we look at this map, I tried to get a map that would have really something really simple that we could see. Robert Schenck's headquarters are in Baltimore, and he is in charge of defending the B&O Railroad through Maryland and across the Virginia-Maryland border along the Potomac River out to Ohio. It's much like General Howard thinking he commanded troops on the first day from his headquarters on Cemetery Hill. He doesn't take an active role in what goes on, and he is, just not even paying attention to the telegraph during the campaign. You'll find out as the program goes on, I don't like Robert Schenck. I think he's incompetent. Schenck is a politician. He was a political general. Reminds me a lot of Sickles. So has no experience. He's only there because Abraham Lincoln gave him a commission as a general. He was a political ally of Abraham Lincoln. And, throughout his stint as commander of the Middle Military District, he makes lots of errors in judgment, let's say. So Robert Schenck believes that his main job is to protect the B&O Railroad. Maybe perhaps because he is an owner of part of a railroad also, and maybe has some friends in the B&O Railroad. And maybe he so defenses the B&O Railroad that, other important factors don't seem to play a role in his thinking. But you might notice on the map I kind of labeled where the B&O Railroad is along the Potomac and through Maryland. There's also another railroad that was destroyed in 1862, and that's the Winchester Potomac Railroad, and that's that red line that leads over to Winchester, Virginia. And the loss of that railroad was devastating to some of the promoters of the railroad earlier in the war. Now, Robert Schenck believes that the best way to protect, well, I was going to do Henry Halleck first. Henry Halleck, who was Schenck's boss, believes the best way to protect the railroad is to put small garrisons along the B&O Railroad itself. And then if there's a raid, you can, these forces can be in position so as to skirmish with the enemy and drive these troops back. Schenck didn't believe that that was an effective way of defending the railroad because the raiding parties by Jones or Imboden would destroy part of the railroad, and then the trains would have to halt, and you'd have to fix the damage that they did, and it was a constant problem, these raids along the railroad. So Schenck believes they should keep a force in the valley well out in front of the railroad to keep the Southern raiders at bay and thereby protect the railroad and have a couple small garrisons at different locations. But his main garrison was at Winchester, Virginia. Henry Halleck knew that Winchester was not a very easily defended position, and that's one of the reasons he did not want troops stationed there. Now, the other factor is Robert Milroy is in charge of the garrison in Winchester, and he is, let's just say he's a little bit overconfident. Henry Halleck, during the threat of Confederate invasion, wants Schenck to order Milroy back to Harper's Ferry away from Winchester for fear that the Winchester garrison might be gobbled up. Schenck does not want Milroy to leave unless there's a specific threat. And Milroy is telling people that he can hold no matter what Robert E. Lee's army throws against him. And so the basic problem is, and I don't want to make it too confusing, but these three men did not communicate well with each other. And I would say Schenck is worse than the other two. That's why I have him in the middle. But these men are responsible for Winchester, Virginia being surrounded and destroyed at the outbreak of the Gettysburg campaign. And we could go into greater detail about the ramifications of the destruction of Winchester, but it's just in our story, it's just important to know that Winchester is going to be destroyed. The garrison is going to be. There are about 7,000 men are at Winchester, and in the battle that lasts 3 days there, the Union Army loses 4,000 of those 7,000 men. Now, here I have a modern Google map, and you can see 4 places we're talking about: Winchester, Martinsburg, Harper's Ferry, and Berryville. And there are garrisons of troops at each of these locations. Milroy has troops at Winchester and Berryville. And he has troops at Berryville because the railroad between Winchester and Harper's Ferry was destroyed. So he has to have wagons bring supplies into his garrison from Harper's Ferry. And so he has one of his brigades under a guy named Andrew McReynolds in charge of the garrison at Berryville to watch the gaps in the mountain range, the Blue Ridge Mountains, to watch the fordings along the Shenandoah River, and to protect the supply wagon road against raids and forays by the Southerners into the area. Here's again, this is that map from Samuel Bates. It shows the same areas. You can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. And you see the mountain range that runs from Harper's Ferry down along the eastern border of the Shenandoah Valley and the Shenandoah River that runs at the base of it. And I'm sure you guys have read some of this stuff about the different mountain gaps. But what are we talking about? The Harper's Ferry Gap or the Potomac River Gap. And then there's like Ashby's Gap, the Bull Run Gap, Chester Gap, Keys Gap. But you know, it's Chester Gap near Front Royal that the Southern Army will come through and make their appearance south of Winchester when they attack the town. So Winchester, Virginia is attacked by Richard Ewell's force on June 13th, 14th, and 15th. There's fighting, 1863. And the Southerners suddenly appeared south of the town on June 13th. And Milroy was not really given insightful alerts by his boss, Robert Schenck. And Halleck was trying to order Milroy away from Winchester, but Schenck was getting in his way, and it ended up that Milroy held out too long, got surrounded. He tried to retreat and cut his way back to Harper's Ferry on the morning of the 15th, and his force was surrounded and greatly defeated. And of course, all important for us, Jack Skelly is wounded on the morning of June 15th, forever altering our lives. Yes. In case you don't know, that's Jack Skelly's Jenny Wade's boyfriend. Okay. So now what we're going to talk about tonight is a wagon train that has its start at Berryville. And we already talked about Andrew McReynolds. What do you think of him? Yeah. So he's a brigade commander in Milroy's division. Milroy has a division of the 8th Army Corps. Again, it's commanded by Robert Schenck overall at Baltimore. But McReynolds, he was ordered that if attacked to fall back to Winchester. And he had been ordered to be ready for a surprise attack. At least he was paying attention to that from the correspondence that we sent in. And so he had about 20 or so wagons with the supplies of his brigade. And on the morning of June 13th, which is a Saturday, the Southern Army suddenly appeared, in force below Berryville. As a matter of fact, the night before, he had a skirmish with the Confederate Army at Dinosaur Land. Does everybody know where Dinosaur Land is? Awesome. That's an obscure reference. If nobody knows what it is, that's all right. So the wagons were sent ahead. Now, the Confederate cavalry under Albert Jenkins quickly cut off the road leading directly to Winchester from Berryville. So McReynolds ordered his wagons to Bunker Hill, which is a town along Route 11, the Valley Turnpike. And the plan was for them to ride northward, get to Bunker Hill, where there was a detachment of Union soldiers stationed, and then ride south into Winchester, while McReynolds and his infantry kind of went a slightly different direction. So basically, we're talking about almost 30 miles from Berryville through a place called Summit Point and up and around to get to this location at Bunker Hill. And at this point in the story, I should tell you that the wagon train is commanded by McReynolds' son, Benjamin Franklin McReynolds, who was the brigade commissary. And also with the brigade train is a guy named Lieutenant William Henry Boyd, Jr., not to be confused with William Henry Boyd, Sr., who was a captain of the same regiment, who is not the father of William Henry Boyd, Jr. Do you know it was more common in that day to name a junior could be like a nephew or a cousin? Not necessarily does the senior and junior have to be father and son. Oh, you can jump up there. For instance, I think Nicholas Kadori Sr. and Nicholas Kadori Jr. here in town at the time of the battle. That's his nephew. That's not his son. But anyway, he's in charge. He's the acting brigade quartermaster, William Henry Boyd Jr. Accompanying the wagon train, or Company H of the 1st New York Cavalry, and this detachment is commanded by Lieutenant Franklin G. Martindale. And so these supply wagons travel to Bunker Hill. Now, on their way to Bunker Hill, they're joined by another wagon train that was coming from Harper's Ferry. And that particular wagon train, it had 24 empty trains in it. And they were returning, well, actually, they had taken 24, empty trains to Harper's Ferry, loaded them with supplies, and were in the process of bringing them back. And they got word that the Southerners were attacking, and they struck across country to join the other wagon trains at Bunker Hill. So at this point, there are something like 45 wagon trains in this column, and this is going to grow. That's why I'm trying to make it a little bit simple. Well, they get to Bunker Hill, and the plan is they're going to then ride south to Winchester. And at Bunker Hill, there's a bridge across the Opequon or Opequon, depending on how you like to pronounce it. Did you ever notice that Opequon Creek and Opequon is pronounced differently? Depending, I guess, if you're local or somebody who's writing about it later. But at Bunker Hill, there's 2 companies, the 87th Pennsylvania. And one of the companies is from Hanover, Pennsylvania. And apparently one of the heroes of the skirmish at Bunker Hill was Vincent Eckert of Hanover, Pennsylvania. There's also 2 companies of the 116th Ohio and a detachment of the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry. There's about 200 men there. Well, the wagons get to Bunker Hill. They're just kind of resting. They're feeding their horses. Again, since the morning, you can see they've ridden like, this wagon train has traveled like 30 miles. And all of a sudden, detachment of Albert Jenkins' Confederate Cavalry Brigade appears. And there's a skirmish at Bunker Hill. The infantry moves in front of the wagon train. Lieutenant Martindale gets his wagons together, and Boyd, and they get everybody back on the road. Apparently they were in the field beside the road, and they start off towards Martinsburg. And there are some crazy accounts of the fighting that took place there. Some of them are kind of maybe unbelievable. According to the New York Herald, in an interview that was obviously given by Lieutenant Martindale, who's in charge of the guard, while resting at Bunker Hill for a short time, Martindale received information a large cavalry force was closing in his rear with intention of capturing the train. He immediately took with him 10 men and rode back to reconnoiter. It was a small force to keep in check the 1,500 men that were closing in on them, as had been ascertained that they were hot in pursuit of him. Let's see. And then, ordering his bugler to sound the charge, he dashed at the head of the column with 10 of his men. And since the enemy had no ear for music, he was able to drive them back. So 10 men drove back 1,500 troopers. Yes. And meanwhile, the wagon train got on the road, and the wagon train heads towards Martinsburg, now in West Virginia. And again, that's another 18 miles. And they'll reach there at 9 p.m. that night. Now, in case you're wondering, there is a skirmish at Bunker Hill after the wagon train leave between the companies of the 200 men that were there for the Union Army and Albert Jenkins' guys, and they hold out. A bunch of guys are killed and captured in that battle, and that garrison at Bunker Hill is able to, through a rainstorm that night, able to retreat back to Winchester and join the rest of the garrison. But now the wagons are in Martinsburg. Meanwhile, it's become evident to, oh, there's one story I have to tell you before I start. At Berryville, Captain William Henry Boyd, Sr., not the junior guy, he had his wife with him. And we're not exactly sure why his wife, camped with him. He had been court-martialed earlier in the war because he had an aide to camp in his tent that turned out to be a woman disguised as a soldier. I kind of think maybe she was there because she was trying to keep her husband in line. But Mrs. Boyd and two small children, Andrew, age 12, and her daughter Minnie, I think she's like 8, are at the rear of the wagon train when Albert Jenkins attacks. They're trying to get on the road, and the wagon overturns, and they're captured by the Southern Army, and she and her children are taken to Richmond, Virginia as prisoner. And it's weeks before they're released. When the Southern Army capture Winchester, they gather up a whole bunch of women and their children who they deemed as traitors and took them to Libby Prison in Richmond, and there's articles about that in the Richmond newspaper. But Captain Boyd, his wife was captured in the debacle. So meanwhile, the wagon trains get to Martinsburg. And at Martinsburg that night, the wagon trains are joined by 114 other wagons that had been sent to Martinsburg a couple days earlier from Winchester. These were supplies that had been sent out just in case the Southern Army attacked. And in addition, there were some other wagons that arrived from a place called North Mountain Depot, which is another sort of railroad stop just to the north and west of Martinsburg. So altogether, and of course they had wagons at Martinsburg that were gathering up government stores and supplies there. So at this point, according to a man named Lieutenant Grant of the 6th Maryland Infantry, who joined the wagon train from Harper's Ferry, there are 200 government wagons now at Martinsburg. Why did they not send the wagons to Harper's Ferry at the very beginning of the danger? Why are some sent to Martinsburg? Why did not McReynolds send his force to Harper's Ferry instead of going to Winchester? There's all these questions, and most of them stem from Halleck, Schenck not relaying Halleck's exact orders to Milroy at Winchester, and Milroy not understanding that if he is attacked, he needs to fall back to Harper's Ferry. But for whatever reason, these wagons that are supposed to be in Harper's Ferry are now in Martinsburg. Well, on the 14th, June 14th, the next day, Albert Jenkins attacks Martinsburg, and it soon becomes evident that that town will have to be evacuated. Robert Rhodes' division attacks Martinsburg that night. One interesting thing is Captain Boyd, whose wife and children were captured, he was with McReynolds' brigade at Berryville. And remember, William Henry Boyd Jr., who's not the son of William Henry Boyd Sr., is with the wagon train in Martinsburg. He could be his nephew. I did a little genealogy on him, and I was unable to connect them. So I don't know. It could be a nephew named after him. But in Winchester, Captain Boyd is concerned about his wife and children. So he asked Milroy, the telegraph lines are down, I'll get a message through. And so he takes his company, and during the night, he's able to get through and on the morning of the 14th, arrive at Martinsburg with word that Milroy is surrounded by 18,000 Southerners. He thinks he can hold out a few days, but he needs help. Of course, the telegraph's dead. There's no way to get a message to him. He's going to be surrounded, and things are going to be really bad for Milroy. But in the meantime, Boyd, Captain Boyd now, joins the wagon train and will be with the wagon train all the way to Harrisburg for the next part of the journey with a company of soldiers. So again, at this point, there are about 200 wagons, and the guy in charge of the defenses of Martinsburg, a guy named General, oh, there's Boyd. I forgot I put that in there, but I found this photograph of William Henry Boyd, who does play a significant role in the Gettysburg campaign because he's involved in the skirmish at Greencastle on June 22nd, where the first Union soldier is killed in Pennsylvania during the campaign. Now, what must this wagon look like? Well, we don't have any pictures of the wagons, but according to this point, the guy who's placed in charge is a guy named Quartermaster Enoch Finch. And he was at Martinsburg when he arrived there, and he's going to take overall command. He's born in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. He was a merchant at Morgantown, West Virginia, Virginia, at the outbreak of the war. And he joined the Army in 1861. He's in charge of the quartermaster supplies. And he said in an account in the Baltimore American on July 8th that he has 200 wagons, 40 which were filled with quartermaster stores. Along with the wagons were 7 ambulances, 1,152 horses, and 35 mules. Each wagon is said to have been pulled by 4 horses or mules. In the line of march, the train occupies a length of 3 miles. And, I just pulled together some photographs we have of other wagon trains. The Union Army supply wagons entering Petersburg, Virginia in 1865. Oh, wagon trains on the Middle Bridge at Antietam Creek. The next leg of the journey is from Martinsburg to Williamsport. Now, when you read the accounts, they left Martinsburg at 4 p.m. The Union forces in Martinsburg hold out until dark when they evacuate and Rhodes' division moves in. But according to the accounts given by the quartermasters themselves, the Confederate Army is in hot pursuit, and they are nipping at their heels the whole time and are being hotly pursued. And this is the story, they're going to stick to it in their post-war accounts of it, which is somewhat annoying when you read them. Okay. It's 20 miles from their camp north of Martinsburg to Hagerstown. And of course, they had to travel through Williamsport. It's 24 miles to Williamsport from Martinsburg, I should say. And you can imagine they had to cross a pontoon bridge at Williamsport. So who knows what that must have looked like. Now, when Albert Jenkins' force arrived at Martinsburg, Albert Jenkins sent a message and told the commander at Martinsburg, which at that point was General Tyler, to tell the civilians that they had 40 minutes to evacuate the town because he was going to begin to shell the town, and that he wanted the civilians to know that they better get out of the area. Milroy's force had been at Winchester since January, so since the beginning of the year, and it's been like 6 months, and who knows, hundreds of slaves have escaped and are behind the Union lines. And now all the loyal Virginians, all the escaped slaves that had congregated in northern Virginia had to retreat up the same road, basically, that the wagon train is also retreating on. So all of a sudden, you have wagons of civilians mixed in with the wagon loads of military supplies. And they're all heading up Route 11 towards the Potomac River and into Maryland and Hagerstown. And they're going to be continually funneled northward along this route. At the very height of this, accounts claim that there's like 500 wagons in the cavalcade. And again, some of these are soldiers with government supplies. And some of these are families from the south who were escaping northward. Here's a great view, and this is a stereo. And the caption at the Library of Congress on the original stereo is, "A loyal Southern family escaping the tyranny of, rebels that are coming into their area." So, can you imagine? And you can't really tell in this photograph I have of it, but the Southern lady is smoking a pipe. So, but I mean, what must this look like when, these families are in these wagons and they're just, slowly treading northward. And by all accounts, the civilians are going at a pretty slow rate early on. Okay. So, let's see, what's my next one? So it's, you can see it's 13 miles from Williamsport to Hagerstown, and the wagon train reaches the southern outskirts of Hagerstown and go into camp, I think about 9 o'clock that night on the 14th. Now, at this point, the wagon train is trying to get to Harper's Ferry. So Milroy's wagon train should drive east the next morning on the 15th from Hagerstown to Frederick to Harper's Ferry. At this point, there are no Confederate troops that have crossed the river between Williamsport and Shepherdstown. So it's not like there's a threat that Confederates are going to cut them off on their way to Frederick. But that's exactly what they believe may happen if they travel in that direction. And there's a person at this point that interferes with the route of the wagon train and, again, doesn't receive as much attention as he deserves for being the bad guy in my slide PowerPoint. And that is who I refer to as the architect of the disaster at Winchester, Robert Schenck. He decides that, you know what, I don't want to chance the military supplies going eastward at this point, and he orders them to Chambersburg to be turned over to the quartermaster at Chambersburg, whoever that is, because maybe he doesn't even know it at this moment, but all the military stores in Chambersburg are gone. They move them out on the railroad towards Harrisburg, and can't even figure out who the quartermaster might be that he's referring to. There's like, well, we'll talk about that in a moment, who's there, but there's no one to turn them over to. Okay. And if Schenck would have allowed Milroy's wagon train to turn and ride to Frederick and back to Harper's Ferry, my story probably would not exist. This would not be a story at all. But it's the next part of the journey that is a serious issue. So on the morning of the 15th, after some debate about which route they're going to take, because they just got a telegram from Schenck ordering them northward up Route 11, they head to Greencastle. I should mention that there's some really good maps in some of the newspapers at the time. Here is the Philadelphia Inquirer, I believe, on June 27th, 1863. And you can see that not only did they have, June 27th, not only did they have a really nice map showing the route of Milroy's wagon train from down at Hagerstown to Harrisburg, but you notice in the blown up section there, they show Gettysburg on the map. And it's kind of interesting that, you know, you can see on maps at the time that, and reading articles about it, that Gettysburg is a pretty prominent location on these maps, and especially as the troops start moving in that direction. Okay. Let me get to the next one. So now they're going to travel on the morning of the 15th, and according to one of the accounts by Lieutenant Grant, who's with the 6th Maryland Infantry I mentioned, they leave Hagerstown at 6 a.m. and they're going to cross over the Pennsylvania line and ride into Greencastle, Pennsylvania. And according to the history of Waynesboro, Franklin County, Pennsylvania, Monday, June 15th, was enacted a scene along the great highway from the Maryland line to Harrisburg, which beggars description and still lives in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Certain now of the approach of the Southern Army and in dread as to the detail of its purpose, the farmers for miles around, taking with them their horses and mules, and in many instances their livestock and other description, made a grand exodus from their homes to places of safety beyond the reach of the invader. Following closely in the wake of the farmers came the affrighted multitude of contrabands, Negroes, men, women, and children from the southern border of Pennsylvania, from Maryland, and even from Virginia, hastening northward. The climax of the confusion, however, was reached when the band of refugees were suddenly overtaken and nearly overwhelmed by McReynolds' routed and fleeing wagon trains, numbering, they think, 50 wagons, and a scattered cavalry guard, which made its mad career, had marked effect on the route. Okay. So, we have a bunch of accounts of Greencastle. This illustration is actually printed, I think, in Frank Leslie's Illustrated. I don't have the date because I got this from one of those books that's published after the war of sketches from the war. But this sketch is farmers from Chambersburg fleeing towards the Susquehanna River. So this drawing, probably done engraving before the Battle of Gettysburg, actually shows some of the civilians fleeing towards the Susquehanna. So, I mean, you know, we just don't have, you know, any illustrations. Oh, I like this one because they said they're mules. Now this is oxen, and this is a contraband in the South, you know, fleeing from the scene of a battle. We have tons of accounts of the problems created by the wagon train. J. Howard Wirt, who's on the left, in his book on the Gettysburg campaign, wrote that stragglers from Milroy's army hurried into Pennsylvania at many points and traveling by many different routes, all bore the tidings of alarm and disaster. As this mute evidence of federal defeat passed in haste from town to town of the fertile Franklin and Cumberland counties, it everywhere aroused the fears of bankers, merchants, farmers, and the hapless Negro as to what the future had in store from them. And of course, we know that Albert Jenkins is going to systematically gather up contraband and, you know, people he thinks have escaped from Northern Virginia and take them prisoner in the early part of the Gettysburg campaign. So there's every reason to believe, you know, these people should fear for their life. Now, Abner Doubleday, who wrote one of my favorite books on the battle, Gettysburg and Chancellorsville, it's a really good book. He actually mentions, he's one of the few books that actually has a section about Milroy's wagon train. On Monday morning, which would be the 15th, at 6 o'clock, the government train consisting of 300 wagons commenced to pass through, taking the road to Chambersburg. The movement of the trains was orderly and well conducted up until this time. I don't think so. But little haste was manifested by the wagon masters of the drivers. Some 2 miles back towards Hagerstown, unfortunately, the rear of the train became frightened at the discharge of a gun in the hands of a person who was hunting game. That's his story. The alarm spread from the rear to the front with lightning speed. A panic seized the drivers, and then was enacted a scene that beggars description. Oh, you know what? I'm not reading Doubleday's account. I'm reading the Greencastle newspaper's account. I'm sorry. The teamsters, pale with affright, uttered the most terrific shouts at their horses with whips and clubs. They urged the poor exhausted horses without mercy. Now, Doubleday says, the teamsters and fugitives from Winchester, making for Chambersburg in all haste, told the inhabitants of the towns through which they passed that the rebels were close behind them. This created the wildest excitement, and in many cases had occurred in which Negroes had been seized and sent south to be sold as slaves. The whole colored population took to the woods and filled up the roads in all directions. So at this point, things are really going to get out of control. So let's take our break. But before we do that, what did I do with I have our raffle prizes. Oh, I think they're gift certificates since I don't have anything here with them. Oh, how am I going to do the raffle? Well, I'll have to get the tickets, and Libby has the tickets. I can't do the raffle. We'll do it when we come back here in a second. Sorry if you had a raffle ticket. Okay, well, let's take a 5 minute break here. Very good, very good, very good. Sorry, guys, nobody back here. Okay, so this is another image of fleeing contraband. I think this is near Beaufort, South Carolina. So, when you look through, if you go to the Library of Congress website and you put contraband or fugitives or refugees, you get an interesting assortment of drawings and views that were done during the Civil War. And, a lot of the contraband obviously are former slaves that were escaping northward. And of course, this, this event kind of hastened their departure from northern Virginia. Now, 17 miles from Greencastle to Chambersburg. And again, you see how this time I got the line on Route 11 instead of Route 81. So, and this is where it really gets interesting, where they reach Chambersburg. And again, now it's a mixture of fleeing civilians, escaped slaves, free slaves from Maryland and southern Pennsylvania, wagons of families and supplies, all mixed together. According to A.K. McClure, who is here on the right. Oh, let's see. I was going to read Samuel Bates first. He's on the left. According to Samuel Bates, who wrote a history of the battle and is a Pennsylvania historian immediately after the war, he wrote, that's Wirt. Oh, here he is, Samuel Bates. He wrote, the Hygeria thus commenced received a fresh impetus at 9 o'clock in the morning by the arrival of the advance of Milroy's wagon train, which had escaped across the Potomac and was making haste to put itself beyond the reach of the enemy. As the long, dusky train wound through the town of Chambersburg, affrighted citizens seized the inhabitants and spread widely through the country. Alexander McClure, who is the gentleman on the right, who's the editor of the Franklin Repository, wrote, about 9 o'clock in the morning, the advance of Milroy's retreating wagon train jazzed into the town, attended by a few cavalrymen and several affrighted wagon masters, all of whom declared that the rebels were in hot pursuit, that a portion of the train had been captured, and that the enemy was about to enter Chambersburg. This startling information, coming from men in uniform who had fought valiantly until the enemy had got nearly within sight of them, naturally gave a fresh impetus to the citizens, and the skedaddling commenced in magnificent earnestness. So let's put this a little bit of perspective. The Southern Army is invading Pennsylvania, but they're 8 hours away. They're 8 hours behind this train. The rear of the train is not being overrun by the Southerners. It's just, you know, I don't know how, as you're speeding up the road, the word keeps passing from the rear to the front, and hey, they're behind us, hey, you know, get going. But it caused big problems wherever it went. Now, you know, I guess in the bigger scheme of things, you might say, hey, you know, they alerted the whole Cumberland Valley that the Southerners were about to invade. But let's see. Which one do I have? Oh, Jacob Hoke. Did you ever read The Great Invasion by Jacob Hoke of Chambersburg? Really good book on the Gettysburg campaign, written in the 1880s. He wrote that the wagon masters declared that the enemy were in close pursuit, that a large part of the train had been captured, and the dreaded foe was about to enter Chambersburg. As they came dashing down our street, drivers alternatively lashed the poor animals and looked back to see if the enemy were in sight. The scene of terror and confusion were perfectly terrific. Near the corner of Main and Queen Street, one of the horses dropped dead from exhaustion. It is said that all along the road from the Potomac to this place, wrecked wagons and broken down horses and mules were left by the way. How many horses died because of this wagon train? It's kind of hard to imagine. There's a guy named Lieutenant Charles Palmer of Company C, Maryland Purnell Cavalry. He had been in duty on as a provost guard for Chambersburg some weeks before the invasion and was in command of about 8 men. And he was standing in the center of the town as the wagons approached the public square at headlong speed. He observed the needless panic. He drew his revolver and ordered the teamsters to halt. And the accounts given of him suggested he slowed them down somewhat, and that they were less, they sped away a little slower, but they still went to Shippensburg that night before they rested. And I'm sure I have it here somewhere. They went 40 miles that day with these wagons. And they camped for the night near Shippensburg. News of the panic along the road between Hagerstown and Harrisburg, along with the wild and exaggerated rumors, were sent out over the telegraph wires and were reported by the newspapers all across the country. And many papers placed the blame squarely on the head of the soldiers. The Weekly National Intelligencer of Washington, D.C., for instance, published, "The recent panic in Pennsylvania was largely due to the very rapid progress made through the state by General Milroy's wagon train in retreating from Winchester into Pennsylvania." At some point on the 15th, Robert Schenck starts to get news of this massive panic in the Cumberland Valley. And here's a dispatch that he sent to General Couch at 7:30 that evening that shows how out of touch with reality Robert Schenck really is. "What proof is there that the enemy have appeared at Hagerstown? I wonder if the panic was not created by a detachment of the 1st New York Cavalry I had there at 9 a.m. They were escorting and following wagon trains from Martinsburg, which I ordered them to take to Greencastle and to Chambersburg, and then turn them over to the quartermaster to Latter Place. I have just been assured by telegraph from Frederick that until afternoon today, not a single Confederate soldier has appeared at either Shepherdstown or Williamsport. I think your people are in a panic that has thus far, in a good measure, been causeless. Yeah. First of all, when he writes that message, Albert Jenkins is in Greencastle on his way to Chambersburg. And the Southern Army is passed through Hagerstown. And we're talking about 1,500 men passed through. Do you want to pass through? You can go down. You can go that way. I'll talk to you. So, and of course, the other thing is the causeless panic he's referring to by the Pennsylvania citizens was caused by him sending the wagon train there anyway. Oh, I don't like Robert Shank. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Shank telegraphed Couch at Harrisburg and said, "The reports from Philadelphia newspapers this morning astonish us here. I think there is a sad panic. Please tell me if you have really reliable information of the enemy being either at Chambersburg or Mercersburg or even at Hagerstown." I have not. What is he doing? All the newspapers are publishing the whereabouts of the Confederate Army, and some of these reports are by officers under his command. Captain Boyd is going to the telegraph and sending messages, and Palmer is sending and Couch, and here he just doesn't believe the reports that the Southern Army are invading. Now, given Shank's going to have some real problems here later this morning, because he's going to realize that Milroy's forces have been destroyed at Winchester, and he's got bigger problems and bigger fish to fry. But he continues to cause misinformation. There he is, Shank. And of course, what if you're Governor Curtin in Harrisburg or Darius Couch, and this idiot just keeps, you're trying to figure out where the Southerners really are and what damage has been done. Chambersburg was captured by the Southern Army on the evening of the 15th. And there's some serious issues, and Shank wants to know if the Southern Army is in Hagerstown. So on the 16th, they're going to head off the wagon train from Shippensburg to Carlisle. Again, 28 miles. I think that the wagon train only stayed for a few hours that night in Shippensburg, just to give time for the horses to water and to rest a little bit. And then they got them hitched up again and they took off. And of course, we're not going to talk about that, but they cause a huge panic in Carlisle. From Carlisle, it's another 33 miles along, Route 11, and then onto what is, well, it's not Route 11 anymore now, there is it? But we're talking about traveling on Market Street through Mechanicsburg and Camp Hill towards the bridge at Harrisburg. And so if we look at both of those, let's see, what's that? Wow. That's like 60 miles on the 16th. Okay, so at Harrisburg, and did you guys ever read the book about the defensiveness of Harrisburg? It used to be a little pamphlet you could buy. I really love the map in there that shows that creek. What's the name? Anybody know how to pronounce that? Cana de Gwinnett? No wonder I'm having trouble. But here is a military map that was done of the road we're talking about leading to the bridges over the Susquehanna River in 1861. And this was a map that was drawn to determine where the defenses of Harrisburg should be positioned. And I put a red arrow on the map at the Susquehanna River because this next illustration I have from my friend Jim Schmick at Civil War and More, who, we should be buying our books from Jim. He's a good guy. This shows the two bridges at that time that crossed the Susquehanna from Camp Hill to Harrisburg. And Harrisburg is in the distance, and the first bridge is the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. And the bridge behind it to the left is going right into City Island. Do you see how it picks up again on the other side of City Island? Both these bridges cross City Island. And that is the Market Street Bridge, or the Camelback Bridge. And the railroad cars, of course, are going across the railroad bridge, and all the wagons and all the civilians fleeing the Cumberland Valley will cross the Market Street or Camelback Bridge. Have you ever been to the Harrisburg Senators game? And you go through Camp Hill, and then you get onto a bridge, and then you drive over and you get off the bridge into the ballpark? That's the Camelback Bridge's location exactly. The modern bridge is in the same place where the old bridge was. What's that?
Does it count if I fished under it?
Oh, that counts. That counts. And what I'd recommend you do for homework, there's some homework you guys should do here. Go to the game, but if you go to the right, and on that part of City Island that's shown between the two bridges, there's a parking garage. And then you walk behind it, you can see the remnants of the old railroad bridge there too. Okay. So here's, I think, a 1902 photograph. Maybe it's a little earlier than that, of the Camelback Bridge. And it was called the Camelback Bridge because the way it was built on the piers, it sort of had some humps in it. There were 4 bays at this bridge. And 2 of the bays were for wagons and pedestrians, I should say wagons and animals going one way or the other, and the 2 on the outside were for pedestrians going in and out on the same. Well, you can go through, or you can come through if you want. I don't want to delay if you want. No, go ahead. Go down to the end. You can talk to them. But I should mention the bridge was first built in 1816, 1817. So it's it was the second longest covered bridge that ever existed. And what is the oldest covered bridge that ever existed? The Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge, just south of it. But look at that thing. So, Milroy's wagon train gets to the bridge. And I'm sure you realize I have like 7 or 8 accounts of it. I'll refrain from reading them all. This isn't the one at Wrightsville, though. That's another bridge. This is at Harrisburg. Milroy's train reached it first, and beasts and 4-footed things innumerable. By night, the steady trump and rumble on the heavy teams lulled the sense of the weary, and through the long hours of the sultry June day, a cloud of dust constantly arose far down the valley. That's not the one I wanted to read. Okay. According to the Harrisburg Telegraph, it was a scene never to be forgotten, and many in our midst will recall to mind the fleeing farmers and their consternation, which was made all the more serious when Milroy's wagon train came whooping across the bridge, having been chased up the valley by the rebels. The toll taker at the east end of the bridge remembered that it was scandalous how fast some of them were going, and they should have been arrested. So there's a toll taker at the eastern end of the bridge. I think in this view we're at the western end of the bridge looking across to Harrisburg. So there's another, they actually had a telegraph wire ran across the top of the bridge also. So after they crossed the bridge, they headed up Market Street. And finally, they had reached the Susquehanna, they had reached their halting point. Let's see. According to one eyewitness, Market Street resembled a farmyard, for there might have been found almost every animal raised on a farm, from a guinea fowl to a Normandy Percheron horse of the heaviest build, from a chicken to a Jersey bull. There were huge loads of grain, hay, corn, oats, household furniture, farm implements, and personal belongings. And the sight was an exceedingly lively one. One interesting sidebar with Milroy's wagon train. They went up Market Street. They went across a railroad track near a canal where Market Street and Cameron Street are today, if you want to see near the site. The site was undeveloped because it was low and it flooded a lot. So it was a pretty open field. And the wagon train stopped there. And according to the Harrisburg Telegraph, writing about it years later, in June of 1863, when Milroy's wagon train was chased up the Cumberland Valley by rebel General Jeb Stuart, I like that, Milroy's train never stopped until it reached a point near Reservoir Park, and almost every wagon had a number of slaves in it who were escaping to freedom. Those slaves settled down in Harrisburg, and some of their descendants may be found residing in the vicinity today. And there's actually another article that I found, and it relates a different version, but the same story. Milroy's wagon train of the Union Army was chased up the Shenandoah and Cumberland valleys by General Jeb Stuart and never quit running until it rested on the hill near the entrance to the present Reservoir Park. In almost every wagon of that train, there was a colored family of refugees, former slaves on their way north to freedom. These colored people encamped where they got off of the wagons, and their descendants live there today. And there's every reason to believe this is true. In the 1880 census, when I look at the area from Market Street up towards Allison's Hill, I just went through, I saw these articles a while back, and I went through the census, and every other family is born in Virginia. So it's fascinating. I don't know if anybody who's ever done any research on this topic, but to me, it's fascinating. I wonder how many people that live in this area, Harrisburg today, are directly descendant from the slaves that escaped from Virginia in Milroy's wagon train, or as part of Milroy's wagon train. Now, here at Harrisburg, Couch immediately telegraphs all the people he can find, including Shank, that, hey, your wagons have arrived. And he says to Shank, Milroy's train is in. It is said to be 500 wagons. And then the wagon masters and the quartermasters start being interviewed by papers across, the north. And they have all kinds of interesting accounts of their adventures. One of them reported that over 500 government wagons with stores valued at $20,000, accompanied by contrabands and refugees, arrived here from Martinsburg. One of them said they left Martinsburg at 4 o'clock on Sunday evening, traveling very fast. The horses are much jaded. I wanted to point out that we do have some images of contraband that have escaped from the South during the war. And just to give you an idea of what the wagon loads of contraband might look like. And these images are both from the Library of Congress website. And this particular image here, which is rare, and I'll bet you a lot of you have never seen it, it's a contraband refugee camp at Vicksburg after the battle. So what do you think the contraband refugee camp looks like in Harrisburg? And let me tell you this, there are 18, according to information taken by the people in Harrisburg who are trying to deal with this, there's 1,800 refugees in this camp on Market Street. It's crazy. This is James Touchstone. He was a member of the wagon train, and we don't have too many pictures of the people who were involved, but he is there. And let's see, he gives an interesting account. Let's see if I can find I got to find the exaggerated accounts. So all the, one of the interesting thing is the articles try to put this in a light that makes the wagon train seem a little bit better. So around the country, articles started being printed that Milroy's entire fleet of wagon trains had arrived. But in the testimony of the conduct of the Committee of the War, the quartermaster at Winchester gave us some interesting statistics. And basically, I could go through them, but he says altogether, Milroy had 207 wagons, or he lost 207 wagons out of 354 altogether when Winchester was overrun. So only this one group of wagons made it to safety. The rest were just captured. Also, it's interesting that when you read some of the accounts, how far they claim to have gone and what amount of time. One account, written right afterwards, says that from Hagerstown at 4 o'clock on Monday, they arrived at Harrisburg on 9 o'clock Tuesday morning with 180 wagons heavily loaded, a distance of 82 miles in a short space of 29 hours. An article published in Harrisburg Union on the 17th said that they made the extraordinary march of 120 miles in 48 hours. Okay, that's not true. It's Winchester that's 120 miles from Harrisburg. And so if we take that, the 114 wagons that went to Martinsburg from Winchester on June 11th, they went 120 miles in 120 hours, not 48 hours. And if we just talk about Mick Reynolds that we've been talking about, who left Berryville on the morning of the 13th, it's 120 miles in 72 hours. So still, it's pretty bad. Okay, so I'm sure you're all thinking that the story is over. And it should be over, but it's not. So the wagon train rested at Harrisburg, spread a whole bunch of misinformation about their grandiose exploits and how they saved, all the supplies from Winchester, and the Confederates were chasing them the whole time. And finally, Schenck orders them to Baltimore. They're in Harrisburg. How do you get to Baltimore? You go through Lancaster and then down, toward the Susquehanna River head, and you cross it, Conewago Dam or something like that, and you come down to Baltimore. Well, they arrive in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on June 28th. What is happening on June 28th? The Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge is being attacked by the Southern Army. And the wagon train, all of a sudden, is being chased again by the rebels from the other side of the river. According to one observer to this event in downtown Lancaster, he called it Lancaster's Dark Sunday. Whilst everybody who had valuables was placing them out of sight, Milroy's wagon train dashed into the city. It did not come in an orderly manner, but a more demoralized set of men never entered this city. The teamsters lashed their horses unmercifully. Every driver seemed to be possessed with the idea that the rebels were but a few feet behind him. The arrival of this wagon train caused the most intense excitement, and the rebels were expected at any moment. How can they think they're being chased again? I just don't understand. So anyway, of course, federal authorities, the militia, burns the bridge at Columbia. Schenck learns of this. The wagon train camps at Lancaster the night of June 28th, and he fears that the Southerners might cross the river. So he decides, and again, this is Schenck, to send a wagon train to Philadelphia. So the wagon train rides to Philadelphia. Now, on this map, I just put it on Google so you can see it's going up to the turnpike and over to Philadelphia. They went across like Route 30 all the way into Philadelphia. So let's see, do I have the, according to the Philadelphia Press, on July 1st, so on July 1st, the start of the Battle of Gettysburg, a wagon load of 230, a wagon train of 230 wagons arrived here and went into camp. So 230 wagons, they say there. And then from Philadelphia, they're sent to Baltimore. And when they get to Baltimore, they're heralded as heroes. And Fitch is his name, Enoch Fitch, the guy from Morgantown, West Virginia, who's in charge of it, he is interviewed in the Baltimore Sun. And boy, no one enjoys his interview more than I do. Let me tell you. I can't tell you how many people even read his interview beside me. But he talks about the great exploit. And according to the paper, it will be, they don't want to give the full account and details of everything connected with this unparalleled retreat, as nothing Captain Fitch started with was captured by the rebels. He estimated the total value of the government stores that he saved at over $1.5 million. In this ever-to-be-remembered retreat, Fitch and his men gained a reputation for perseverance and daring that can hardly be too highly appreciated by the government and the people. Unfortunately, not everybody looked upon this episode the way the newspaper did, and would it surprise you to learn that Fitch is court-martialed? He apparently...
What was the actual value of the stuff?
I had no idea. But you know, I mean, it was government stores and supplies. I wonder this about, well, a couple things I wonder about the supplies themselves. I bet you a lot of it was food for the horses that had to be eaten on the way.
Was all 237 wagons full?
Yeah, everything was full.
Of what?
Yeah.
What happened to the stuff?
Yeah, well, they got back to Harper's Ferry. All the wagons, you can see on my map, after 290 miles from Harrisburg back to Harper's Ferry, they got returned to the regiments in which the stores came from in the first place. So they did. One of my favorite things that I found about it is written by a guy who wrote a book on the Gettysburg campaign from Franklin and Marshall College, a guy named C.M. Heller, who wrote of it and poked fun at it, and he said that they went to Martinsburg, Williamsport, Hagerstown, Harrisburg, Lancaster, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Frederick, and finally Harper's Ferry, thus illustrating the adage that the longest way around is the shortest way home.
Okay. How long did it take them?
Well, let's see. I think they got to Harper's Ferry on July 10th. So they left on June 13th, and they got back to the regiments where they came from on July 10th. So I hope that people didn't need any of their supplies. And also, if I was Darius Couch at Harrisburg, I would have just said, these are my supplies now. There's no way that I would let Schenck have those supplies after all that. So apparently Fitch was a drinker, and he died of dementia tremors in 1864. And Fitch is buried in Morgantown, West Virginia. So another thing for homework, if you go to University of West Virginia, if you ever find yourself there, there's a cemetery, a town cemetery there, and you can visit Enoch Fitch's grave, who was in charge of the unfortunate wagon train at this point.
That reminds me where the Confederate Army was on July 10th.
Yeah, they're on their retreat.
Yeah.
So they're, part of them crossed at Shepherdstown, So there's some issues. Maybe the units they met up with had some of them are Harper's Ferry, I believe. But that's a good point. And then they're going to find themselves. Luckily they didn't send them away again. Maybe I stopped reading too soon, right? Okay. Now there's an investigation into the disaster at Winchester that caused this Milroy's wagon train. And again, Milroy has 7,000 troops, and he loses 4,000 of his men in the debacle there, killed or wounded or captured. And the court-martial is very interesting to read. It's in the same set of ORs that the Gettysburg battle ORs are in, and you could read more about it, and it's fascinating reading to me. And at the end, it's obvious that the guy who's in charge of it, he writes his conclusion that Schenck should be held accountable for what happened. Halleck ordered the men out there. Schenck refused to obey the order. They blame Halleck for not doing something about the fact that this guy who serves under him is disobeying his orders. Well, maybe the guy under him is a political appointed general and is being protected by Abraham Lincoln, and his hands are tied when he's trying to deal with this guy. So in the court-martial, Abraham Lincoln actually is the last message in there, and he doesn't want Schenck to be court-martialed. His basic attitude is, there were plenty of mistakes that occurred, and he's just one of the people that made a few mistakes. But he also blames Halleck and Milroy. And when you look at it, I'll bet you if you get a room of people together that are really interested in this, you'd have some people who hate Milroy, you'd have people that hate Schenck, probably me, by myself, and then you have people that hate Henry Halleck. But I don't know what to tell you.
Two questions. What happened to Milroy? What happened?
Robert Milroy is relieved of command, and immediately afterwards, when he got to Harper's Ferry, he went to Baltimore, and he wasn't sent back with his troops. He was sent all the way to Bedford to command that part of his detachment that retreated out in that direction. And then he's reassigned, and he ends up out in the out west somewhere after the war. So he does. He definitely feels the brunt of it. I wanted to read at the end. I forgot this one quote I found about Enoch Fitch when they talked about his court-martial. He was court-martialed, but they decided that they didn't find him guilty. Or they decided not to push it. Ugh, Santa Claus. He's been bothering me the whole time, Santa Claus. Where is my quote about him? Okay, so Fitch is court-martialed, and although the proceedings were eventually disapproved, he was reassigned, quote, to duties where his blunders may prove less detrimental to the service. That's a pretty strong statement for quite an innocent, huh?
Is that in the record, or is that in the newspaper?
This is in the newspaper of the Record. Very good. You knew that was going to be, yeah. So there might be some opinion added to that there. Okay, and then but Schenck ends up getting away, getting away without getting in trouble, and then he resigns his commission as the head of the Middle Military District, and then he joins the committee for the Joint Committee for the Conduct of the Committee of the War, and he's in a powerful position. So again, I think they have kid gloves on with Schenck, and besides all the stuff I'm talking about with Schenck, I'm from Baltimore. He causes all kinds of serious issues with the civilians in Baltimore during the war, abusing his war powers. Of course, that's what we say.
Was French ever involved in any of this?
General French ends up taking command of the 3rd Army Corps. Does he command a division at Harper's Ferry? Smith is there, and Daniel Tyler's in charge at Harper's Ferry at that moment when all this was taking place. I think French is at Frederick, in charge of a detachment at Frederick at the time this all takes place.
He was supposed to be assigned to a meeting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the program and learning about a little bit about something very obscure. And again, I don't always want to do topics that are just so obscure. It's just I've been researching this for a long, long time, and I thought somebody might enjoy hearing about it. Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, too.